Just after 3:30 a.m. on Thursday the 25th of December 1873, the people of Wichita, Kansas were woken by the noises of an excited gathering crowd on Main Street. Number 73 had caught fire, and the flames were quickly spreading. To the rear of the building, a man was found on the bottom step of the exit, dressed in his night clothes, semi-conscious and bleeding. He had lacerations on his left arm and forehead, and grazes on the back of his neck. The first person to see him was a man named Thomas Johnson. Johnson dragged the man away from the burning building to a nearby drugstore. He was barely conscious, but when he eventually came around, he said his name was Arthur Winner, and he had no recollection of how the fire started or where his wounds came from. When the fire inside the building was tackled, firefighters were shocked when the floor of the story above suddenly caved in. Among the glowing embers and falling debris was a badly burnt body, which hung grotesquely from the wooden beams, then dropped with a thud. Arthur Winner, who was still being questioned by the curious crowd, spoke of his business partner and friend, a man named McNutt, who he said had been brutally attacked and left to burn by an unseen assailant. Joseph McNutt was a well-respected man, originally from Canada. When word of his death reached his home province of Nova Scotia, a heartfelt obituary was printed in a local newspaper. But suspicions surrounding Arthur Winner's story began to form when a life insurance policy belonging to Joseph McNutt for $5,000 came to light. The New York Herald, dated January 3, 1874, included the story in a short article insensitively titled "Robbed and Roasted." They wrote, "The body was horribly burned and beyond recognition. This is supposed to be the body of McNutt, who was foully murdered for his money and his policy. There is a deep and damning plot that is yet to be unfathomed." When the experienced but retired Sheriff William Smith was called to the scene, Arthur Winner told him of how he and Joseph McNutt came to be acquainted through their sign-painting trade back in Kansas City, Missouri. He said they moved to Wichita because they believed it to be an up-and-coming city and an untapped resource. The factory space they had acquired was positioned above a hat and dressmaking business called Mrs. Fardy and Hanley. When Winner spoke of McNutt, he mentioned that he had a young wife back in Kansas City, but added that it had been an unhappy marriage. When discussing the events leading up to the fire, Arthur Winner told Sheriff Smith that he and McNutt had been celebrating Christmas in town and visited several bars. "You could say we did the town," he said jovially. He explained that earlier that day McNutt had made $500, which he had on him while they were out, so they were feeling especially good. He said they returned to 73 Main Street at midnight and spoke until around 3 a.m., which is when they heard Kitty and Ann, the hat and dress shop proprietors, come home. Winner said he remembers getting into his nightshirt while McNutt fell into bed fully clothed. He said they lay there for a while and talked before Joseph fell asleep. Then 15 to 20 minutes later he said he heard a noise in the dark room, like someone else was there. Then he felt a blow to his left side with a sharp implement from an unseen attacker. He said he sprung out of bed and called "watch out" to Joseph before running for the door. Winner said that as he passed through the door he received a blow to the side of his head with a heavy object, which shook his whole body. He could not remember anything between then and when he was found at the foot of the steps of the burning building. Neither did he have any knowledge of what the assailant looked like, how he got in, or how the fire that killed Joseph McNutt had been started. He did, however, put a theory forward that someone had followed them home with the view to steal Joseph's money after hearing them talk openly about the $500 in the local venues. For Sheriff William Smith, the first port of call was the local saloons and hotels McNutt and Winner had visited on Christmas Eve. All the landlords confirmed the presence of the two men and that they had spoken openly about a large sum of money that they had with them. But they also all said that it was unlikely that any of the other patrons in the venue at the time would have hatched such an awful plan. John Ferris, the manager of the Southern Hotel, which is one of the venues McNutt and Winner visited, said much the same, but added that in the early hours of the morning one of the horses was stolen from the hotel's stable. He acknowledged that it may be completely unrelated, but said he thought he'd mention it anyway. For Sheriff Smith, it was food for thought. The sheriff then headed to the railroad station, where he met a group of men who habitually hung around watching the trains come and go. He asked them if they'd seen any quote-unquote tough-looking strangers around recently. One of the men mentioned that he'd seen a man get off the train at midnight the night before. He didn't look tough, he said. He looked bewildered and asked me for directions to Main Street. The witness added that he saw what looked like a telegram in his hand, but he couldn't see what any of it said. William Smith knew that a stranger asking for directions to Main Street was nothing suspicious on its own, but he was curious about the contents of the telegram. He figured that if it had been sent from Wichita and requested the stranger's presence on Main Street on the night of the fire, it could help put the whole matter to rest. Early the next morning, Sheriff Smith walked into the local telegraph office. He requested to look at the outgoing telegrams over the last few days. One was of particular interest. It was addressed to someone named W. Sevier at an address in Kansas City. It was sent on December the 22nd and requested that Sevier take the train that would arrive in Wichita at midnight on December the 24th. The sender of the telegram was Arthur Winner. The office clerk told the sheriff that Sevier had sent a message back to Winner, confirming that he would be on that train. William Smith went straight to the temporary shelter where Arthur Winner was staying. He asked him, "Who is this W. Sevier and where is he now?" Winner replied, "I don't know where he is. He was supposed to come into town on the Kansas City train Christmas Eve, but he did not show up. I met him in Kansas City when I was there on the 15th. He's a paper hanger and was going to work for us." William Smith was sure that Sevier was the man seen at the railroad station on Christmas Eve night, but he didn't press the issue with Winner and left him for now. The next couple of days had several revelations in store. The first involved the matter of the stolen horse from the Southern Hotel barn. One of the sheriff's deputies was doing some investigations into the matter on the outskirts of Wichita. A group of teamsters who were camping said that they saw the horse gallop by in the early hours of Christmas Day. Two of the men said they recognized the rider as Joseph McNutt. Sheriff Smith was then approached by a drugstore owner named John Allen, who, like everyone else in the city, had heard of the McNutt-Winner affair. Allen said he was suspicious of McNutt because he had stopped by his store and purchased a half-ounce vial of laudanum and a pint of whiskey only hours before the fire happened. William Smith was now sure that W. Sevier from Missouri was the dead man at 37 Main Street, and that both Joseph McNutt and Arthur Winner were involved in his death. Then, on December the 27th, William Smith received a telegram from the Metropolitan Insurance Company in Kansas City. A claim had been filed by one Annie Belle McNutt, who said she was the widow of Joseph McNutt, who died very recently and had resided in Wichita. The policy was for $5,000. The insurance company wanted to know if Sheriff Smith believed it to be a legitimate claim. He wrote back and told them to withhold the funds until further notice. On the day he went to the post office to send that letter, the postmaster called him in. There was a letter addressed to Joseph McNutt from Kansas City. It had been there since Christmas Eve, as McNutt had failed to collect it. The extraordinarily ominous message on the back of the letter read, "Let nobody have this but the one that owns it, and if not called for in 3 days, please return to the name on the back." This was followed by the address 602 Main Street, Kansas City, and was signed Mrs. A.B. McNutt. The Wichita Eagle newspaper, dated Thursday, July 2nd, 1874, printed the letter in full. It's a very long letter, but here is some of what she wrote. "Dear, I'm going to write business and my opinion of rats. That is, the sooner you get shot of Winner, the better, for he is a pinchback liar and mischief maker. Now take my advice and drop anything that he has anything to say in and let him slide. The sooner the better, for he will ruin you and me both if it is carried on. Dear, I will sell my bed and everything I have if you let me come to you next week. I am willing to burn in fire and brimstone for you, but my words will never help him along. You may think I am talking at random, but I ain't. Before I would have the name for robbing and murdering for wealth, I will work until I drop dead on this place. Please grant me the privilege of selling all I have and coming down there. I will work and help you make a good, honest living. It's believed that an arrogant Arthur Winner told Annie McNutt about the plan when he saw her during a visit to Kansas City in mid-December. William Smith's next job was to get an extradition order for Annie McNutt and bring her into town. She was apprehended in Kansas City on the 20th of January 1874. According to reports, she accepted her arrest calmly, but was quick to name Winner as her husband's puppet master. Although her letter suggested otherwise, she said she knew nothing of a plot to commit murder and defraud an insurance company. She said that when Arthur Winner had informed her of Joseph's death, she contacted the newspaper in Nova Scotia that printed the obituary, and the only reason she hadn't travelled to Wichita to reclaim his body and arrange a funeral is because she simply could not afford to. It certainly appears from her letter that she genuinely wanted Joseph to leave Winner and abandon a plan which involved murder, although her swiftness to attempt to collect the insurance money would suggest that she was in on it. She claimed that, despite her letter's mention of quote-unquote robbing and murdering for wealth, she knew nothing of a man named Sevier and just wanted to be financially stable after hearing of her husband's death. Now William Smith's thoughts reverted to the large amount of cash McNutt was said to have on his person on the night of the fire. If Joseph had so much money, he thought, why was Annie suggesting that she would sell furniture to buy a train fare to Wichita? Maybe he was hiding his wealth from her, but Smith thought it more likely that the money simply didn't exist, and the very public conversations between McNutt and Winner about having $500 at their disposal was simply an attempt at planting a false motive for murder. Sheriff Smith believed that Winner was just as much at the centre of it as McNutt, but he wanted to bide his time. He knew where Arthur Winner was, so instead of bringing him in, he arranged to have a watch put on his every move, should he attempt to leave Wichita. William Smith then got onto the trail of Joseph McNutt. Annie said she knew nothing of her husband's whereabouts, but intelligence was received by the sheriff on February the 10th in the form of a letter from a man named Barnes in Kansas City. The letter, addressed to Barnes and dated February the 8th, was from his good friend Joseph McNutt, under the pseudonym William Lehead. Postmarked Ray County, Missouri, it not only helped pinpoint his whereabouts, it uncovered a whole new layer to the story when he accuses Annie of conspiring against him with Winner. Part of that letter reads, "While in Wichita, my wife and partner Winner put up an infernal job to take my life for an insurance I had on my life for $5,000. I detected it just in time to save myself. I was the crack of the town. Winner did not suit those people down there, and they spoke to me several times about it." He then claims that just before Christmas, Winner disappeared. This, he said, made him nervous, but he waited it out to see what would happen. He goes on. On the night of the 24th of December at midnight, he brings up W. Sevier. Unbeknownst to me, I think you have seen him in Kansas City. They were both tight. I saw the intention at once. They were to kill me and get that money. I jumped out, got the first clothes I came to, and fled for my life. Those three had it planned nicely but missed. I saw in the paper about 2 weeks ago about me being murdered in Wichita and the building set on fire. I take from that they have killed somebody. I changed my name, as my wits were scared out of me. McNutt then wrote that he wants to bring them all to justice, but fears for his life, and doesn't want to pay a large sum of money for a lawyer to represent him when he has no proof of the vendetta against him. He asks Barnes for advice, and ends the letter with a further lamentation of his innocence. "Thank God I have a clear conscience and intend to keep it so. I insured my life as I could make it pay better than putting it in a savings bank. I also married that woman because I was told it was against the law to live as I did. Trusting your honour as a gentleman to answer this and reveal nothing, I remain your friend, William Lahead. On receiving this letter, Sheriff Smith left Wichita that night. He stopped at Topeka to receive a requisition from the governor and then proceeded to Plattsburgh, Missouri. He arrived on the night of February the 12th. Then he acquired a horse and a map and rode all night, or so the Delaware State Journal wrote, inquiring at each county post office about a man calling himself William Lahead. At the Glen Garden post office in the township of May in southwest Missouri, he was told that William Lahead received his post there and that he worked at a farm about a mile away. Smith left his horse, grabbed his gun, and set off on foot. It was Friday, February the 13th, when Sheriff Smith found Joseph McNutt in a clearing, chopping wood behind a farmhouse. Smith had been lying in wait for half a day. He said he was tempted to shoot Joseph dead but wanted to take him alive. Smith managed to crawl up within 6 feet of McNutt thanks to a large barn and several corn cribs. When he stepped out with his shotgun raised, he told Joseph to drop the axe and raise his hands, which he did. As Smith put his hands in shackles, McNutt said, "Well, you got me at last, haven't you?" Sheriff Smith arrived back in Wichita with his prisoner on Monday, February the 16th. A preliminary hearing before Judge Wyatt was set for the morning of the 25th, but the case had brought so much attention to Wichita, a huge crowd had gathered before the court. People were excited, and there was even talk of a revenge killing, so the hearing was postponed until the next day so that the law could better prepare themselves for a potential mob. Several newspapers reported on the preliminary hearing, and one included an in-depth confession by Joseph McNutt. However, what Joseph McNutt said during that February hearing does not at all reflect what he said at his eventual trial in May and June. The confession, which was printed in full by the Kansas Lawrence Republican Daily Journal, was damning, yet at his future trial he was to change his story completely. I can't find a source that says his confession was later retracted or deemed inadmissible, but I'm assuming he was somehow able to change his statement following legal advice prior to his trial. Whatever the case may have been, this is what McNutt said at the preliminary hearing. He gave his age as 31 and chronicled his history with Winner. He said that they had gone into business together before deciding that honest work was not the way forward. During the summer of 1873, he said Winner pitched an unlawful plan that would make them both rich. It was an arrangement rooted in evil and deceit. When explaining how he was slowly persuaded by Arthur Winner, McNutt said, "He proposed several ways by which we could make some of that desirable article money, but I would not listen to him, as I was afraid to bring disgrace upon my family. Among other things, he proposed that we would organize a band of bandits and go over the country plundering and robbing. He related to me some of the most diabolical crimes I have ever heard, saying that he was the author, and that he had never been under any inconvenience with the law, that the law was a farce, and a man with common sense and a little cheek could elude and defy it at pleasure. But I could not go in with him. I told him I was no rogue and could not be for any amount of money. He laughed at me and called me chicken-hearted. At last, towards the end of September, he proposed to me the crime that was perpetrated in December. I would not listen to him at first, but finally, in an evil moment, I allowed him to talk it up to me, and he painted it in such glowing and sure colours that I began to feel interested in it. In a while I was carried away with the intoxicating thought that I might yet be worth some money and not have to be a dog all my life." McNutt went on to explain how they'd spent many weeks considering where they would set up their new business venture as a front for the crime. He said that they did consider Kansas City and even went as far as renting a building, but Winner had a change of heart, saying that they were better off in Wichita, where, quote, "men were killed every day in the week." Winner painted a picture of Wichita as a lawless land, where they would be able to easily evade a half-hearted law enforcement. Any crime, he told McNutt, would go undetected for some time, giving them adequate opportunity to distance themselves. They moved to Wichita on November 1st, 1873, and stayed at the Southern Hotel until they acquired a shop with a living space above it at 73 Main Street. For a few weeks, McNutt said, they ran a good business. So what was Arthur Winner's grand plan? Well, Joseph explained that Arthur Winner had told him that he knew a poor, desperate fellow in Missouri named Sevier, who would jump at the chance to join them as a partner in business. Winner's plan was to bring him to Wichita, get him drunk and murder him. They would then deface his body so badly that he would be unrecognizable, but they would leave enough false evidence to make it look as if the dead man was Joseph. Meanwhile, Joseph would leave Kansas and go into hiding while his wife would collect his life insurance. When everything was settled down, the three of them would split the insurance money. Oh yes, the insurance money. Well, Joseph explained that back in October of 1873, just a month before he and Winner moved to Wichita, Joseph married his girlfriend Annie, then took out a life insurance policy on himself for $5,000 with the Metropolitan Insurance Company, the sole beneficiary being his new wife. Now to secure their intended victim, Joseph said that on the 14th of December 1873, Arthur Winner travelled back to Missouri where he met with Mr. Sevier and persuaded him to join them in Wichita. He then returned to Joseph 5 days later with the good news. Sevier would be joining them on the 22nd of December. He would travel by train and they would meet him at the station. But Sevier did not show up, and the next day they received a telegram saying that he could not make the journey as he had no money. It was a slight hold-up, but they sent Sevier the money via mail, and for fear that he might not receive it, they also sent it by telegram transfer the same day. On December the 24th, Sevier travelled from Kansas City to Wichita via Topeka. Once at 73 Main Street, the men welcomed Sevier and plied him with booze. Believing he was celebrating a new business venture, the poor man was happy to indulge. McNutt said that Sevier was a clever, good-hearted fellow, and he felt bad for what they were about to do. He said he wanted to bring a halt to the plan, but his heart failed him. He said, Winner was in his element. He knew just how to do everything and do it well. We began to prepare him for death by giving him brandy to drink, of which we had a large supply. When Sevier was unconscious, Arthur Winner poured a pint of laudanum down his throat. They then took an iron pot and filled it with benzene, lifted Sevier's upper body and placed him face first into the pot before setting fire to it. Joseph said that Sevier did not regain consciousness at any point during this abhorrent process. He describes what he saw. We watched him as his head began to simmer and crackle like burning meat, but as he was unconscious, I don't think he felt any pain. When his features were burned and disfigured beyond recognition, we laid him on the bed, which was saturated in dripping oil. Winner then set the mattress alight, engulfing Sevier's body in flames. Joseph McNutt then explained how they attempted to make it look as if he himself had perished in the fire and Arthur Winner had been the victim of a violent attack. He also mentions how he strategically left some of his belongings in the building. I took a bunch of Winner's flesh between my thumb and finger and run the blade of a pair of scissors through it and cut it open. We then opened one of Sevier's veins and took out about a quart of blood, which Winner spread over himself, and thus made himself look as though he had lost a great deal of blood. I then took my departure, leaving my vest and empty pocketbook at the back of the shop, and left on the train for Atchison. From there, I went to Missouri. The proprietors of the hat and dress shop, Kitty Hanley and Annie Fardy, who also lived in the building, were seen running from the fire, while Arthur Winner stumbled into the street feigning serious injury, and Joseph McNutt disappeared into the December morning darkness. McNutt then goes on to explain how he felt when he heard about the outcome of an early inquiry. Ever since then I have been in Missouri. I knew nothing about the developments until 2 days before my arrest, when I read the verdict of the jury. I do not know what Winner did after I left, but I'm sure he must have acted his part well, as he is the most accomplished rogue. This is all I know of the affair. I tried my best to persuade Winner to give up the thought of the crime but could not succeed. I told him it would not succeed, especially in Wichita, for the officers are too sharp and vigilant, more than any city I know in the West. Following Joseph's arrest, Arthur Winner was also apprehended. They were both sent to a jailhouse in Grasshopper Fall, which is now known as Valley Falls, 65 miles northwest of Kansas City. On April 9, 1874, the Wichita Eagle printed a story entitled Jailbirds, which was a summary of a visit to Grasshopper Fall where both men were being held along with other outlaws. There was Joseph McNutt and Arthur Winner, along with 17-year-old Fred Olds, who had murdered a shop owner named Daniel Ferris, and a horse rustler named Dodson, who had also shot several men in Missouri. Dodson, Olds, and Winner were in the same cell, and were described as a merry lot of roosters. Arthur Winner told the Wichita Eagle that he was confident of being cleared by any jury, but wanted the trial to take place outside of Sedgwick County. He believed that if he was cleared of the crime in Wichita, the strong public feeling against him would result in a public hanging by an angry mob. This article is the first to give any idea to the age of Winner, stating that he is no older than 25. We also learn from this article that Annie McNutt was also held at the same jail for a short while. But after much scrutiny by Sheriff William Smith, she was cleared of any charges and moved to a Wichita hotel where she was allowed to remain until her husband's trial, which was set for May of 1874. Arthur Winner and Joseph McNutt were tried separately between May and June of 1874. They both gave evidence at each other's trial. Remember that I said Joseph McNutt had completely changed his version of events regarding his dealings with Winner and the night of December the 24th. When Joseph McNutt first spoke at his trial, he gave his age as 22, not 31 as he had previously. When talking about Arthur Winner, he said he had little experience in the paint trade, and he himself was by far the more experienced of the two. He spoke of the business as a legitimate one. As far as he was concerned, he entered the agreement with the best intentions. There were no plans to kill anyone and no bogus life insurance claims, just honest work. Joseph said that when he and Winner began their partnership in Wichita, the agreement was that Winner would pay him $125 on their arrival in the city. When that money was not paid, he said he threatened to leave the partnership. Joseph then claimed that he'd received a written guarantee from Arthur Winner's father that the money would be paid in time. He said he believed Winner Sr. to be an honest man and agreed to wait for the payment, but it never came. This, he said, is when their friendship turned sour and a plan was hatched to take his life. Regarding the life insurance policy, McNutt said that Winner had pressured him to take it out. According to Joseph, Arthur said that he would help pay for some expensive office equipment once the policy was in place, as shown in his letter to his friend Barnes, and despite the love that Annie clearly had for Joseph, he and his counsel maintained that she was in cahoots with Winner and Sevier, and that all three planned to collect his life insurance money once he was dead. He said that at the time of the fire he hadn't received a letter from his wife in 10 days, even though he had written to her. This, he said, was very unusual and his first inkling that she was involved in the plan. However, for this version of events to hold up in court, McNutt's defense had to put forward an argument that the dead man wasn't Sevier, but a third unidentified man. They argued that there was not sufficient evidence to prove that the body found in the burning building was that of Sevier, but the presiding Judge William P. Campbell presented several points, which when applying common sense, he said, would strongly suggest that the dead man was indeed Mr. Sevier. Judge Campbell pointed out that Joseph said he had seen Sevier in the building with Winner on the night of the fire. It had also been confirmed that Winner had travelled to Kansas City between the 14th and 19th of December, where, according to Joseph, he had gone to meet Sevier to discuss his move to Wichita. There were also witnesses who said that they had seen Arthur Winner in Kansas City and at the Ritchie House in Topeka, a stop-off he made while waiting for his connection train back to Wichita. Also, friends of Sevier in Missouri reported that they hadn't seen him since Christmas time, and among the strongest evidence of all were the telegrams that had been sent between Winner and Sevier discussing their plans to bring him to the city. When speaking about Christmas Eve, the night of the fire, Joseph McNutt introduced two more characters to the yarn, giving a very different story to the one told to Sheriff Smith by the saloon landlords and bartenders. If you remember, they had told the sheriff that Winner and McNutt were out together, jovial and talking about their recent $500 windfall. However, at his trial, McNutt claimed that he had not gone out that night, but Winner had gone out after asking for a loan of $15 from him, which he begrudgingly handed over. Joseph said he had seen Winner earlier in the day out in town with two men, who he only knew as Fletcher and Yates. He said that these men were gamblers and thieves, and he'd recognized them from Kansas City. They looked as if they were talking about him. They were secretive and conspiratorial, he said, and this made him fear for his safety. So he headed home and went to bed at around 10 p.m. At around 1 a.m., he said he heard Winner come home, but he wasn't alone, he was with Sevier. Up until then, McNutt said he knew nothing of Sevier's presence or plans to come to Wichita. As the men took to their beds, he said he felt unsafe, like they were plotting his murder, so he got up and left 37 Main Street. As he went through the back door, he said he saw two men standing in the shadow of the building. He recognized them as Fletcher and Yates and said he overheard one of them say to the other, "Is that McNutt?" Now, he said, he was certain of the danger he was in. His initial plan was to retreat to the Southern Hotel, but then decided it wasn't far enough, so he got on the next train out of Wichita, which was the 1:40 a.m. train to Atchison. Once there, he said he shaved his beard and dyed his hair in the hope that he would not be recognized by his conspirators. From Atchison, Kansas, he said he headed to Ray County, Missouri, so that he could live and work amongst the farming communities. He said that on the 27th of December he found work at a farm owned by a man named Mr. Montfort in the town of New Garden. There wasn't much work, but Montfort paid him what he could. A few weeks later, Sheriff William Smith showed up and arrested him while he was working on the farm. He said that while he was there, he received a letter from his wife's sister. He said it gave no details of Annie or her well-being, but informed him that he was a wanted man. McNutt said that that's when he read in the newspaper about what had transpired in Wichita. That is, that there had been a body found, which they believed to be him, and that his wife had been arrested. When asked about the purchases of laudanum and whiskey, he said it was entirely for personal use. He claimed to have been suffering badly with toothache, so used the laudanum and whiskey to take away the pain. He even presented a rotted tooth to the judge, claiming it to be his. A county attorney for the prosecution named Henry Sluice rebutted with the following statement. The notion that his mind was full of suspicion against Winner and the other men while he takes 2 drinks of whiskey and a dose of laudanum and goes to bed, throwing himself completely in the power of the men he pretended to dread, is preposterous. No, the whiskey and laudanum were bought for Sevier, who was, that very hour, on his road to Wichita where he was to be sacrificed. When the matter of the planted evidence was brought up, namely McNutt's pocketbook and vest, which was luckily not consumed by the fire, there was an entry in the book which read $500 received from H.T. Munn. McNutt claimed it was not his handwriting and he knew nothing about it. It was strongly believed that this receipt was written out to support the story of the $500 windfall, and the reason McNutt and Winner were followed home that night by an assailant who, according to their original story, killed Joseph. But now that Joseph had been found alive and well, this story no longer served them, hence the denial of knowledge. When it came to the matter of the correspondence between Joseph McNutt and Barnes while McNutt was on the road, McNutt's counsel argued that the letters were further proof of his innocence, because, after all, the only reason he had used a different name is because he feared for his life and did not want to be found. The prosecution argued that if McNutt was innocent and he truly believed that he was in danger, why did he contact his friend Barnes and not the police directly? The prosecution also made the point that if McNutt truly feared for his life, why did he stop off in Missouri, knowing that his wife, who he believed to be conspiring against him, lived so close by? McNutt's defense responded by saying that he chose to be close to his wife and her family because he wanted to find out what their plans were to dispose of him. If he was truly guilty, they said, he would have travelled further afield than Missouri. This was seen as a ridiculous rationale. County Attorney Henry Sluice said that it was far more likely that McNutt was in fact in the vicinity of his wife to await the payout of the insurance money, at which point they would reunite and enjoy the wealth, and the fact that Joseph had received a letter from his sister-in-law while on the run further proved this. When Annie Fardy and Kitty Hanley, the proprietors of the dress shop, testified, they said that on the night of the fire they heard no sounds of a struggle during the time of Sevier's death, they just heard men talking. In summing up, McNutt's defence lawyers tried to appeal to the Christian sensibilities of the jury by saying that God will judge and punish those who put an innocent man to death. During Arthur Winner's trial, his counsel tried to argue that Sevier was dead before he was set alight, but the judge brought out a report by Dr. Owens, who had examined the body, saying that the level of coagulation in the blood proved that he died in the fire. The final documents for the state of Kansas versus Arthur Winner sums up this unfortunate man's fate. It states, Sevier was probably one of the most suitable persons that could be found for their nefarious purpose. He was a drunken, worthless fellow who could probably be easily induced to drink whiskey and laudanum. He was without family or property and was likely to cause as little inquiry as that of almost any other person that could have been found. Then there was the matter of the false injuries to Winner. As we know, the idea was for Joseph to cut Arthur enough to bleed, and convincingly enough for the authorities to believe that he had bled heavily and that Sevier's blood was his own. But when he was examined following the events of that Christmas morning, it was noted by the doctor who saw him that his cuts were minor and did not reflect the amount of blood present on his clothing. One of the last points made by the county attorney Henry Sluice was the following. It seems that the council's whole theory is that Winner was the only guilty party, and that McNutt was the one conspired against. However, there is a strong train of circumstances that point directly to McNutt's complicity. There was a great deal of interest in the trial, and it attracted a large daily crowd. It said that there was an especially large turnout of women on the day of the verdict. One woman slipped Winner a note that read, "Though your sins are as black as dye, they shall be made white as snow." The same woman later wrote on his holding cell door, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord." Throughout his trial, Arthur Winner had a completely carefree air about him. Maybe it was his devil-may-care attitude that attracted this kind of attention. When the guilty of murder verdict was read, he appeared unmoved. The Sumner County Press, dated Thursday, June the 18th, 1874, wrote, "When the verdict was being read, and while all others were listening to it with the greatest attention, he alone preserved an air of careless indifference, as if he was the last person who could be affected by it." After the verdict, Winner was taken to a holding room. Being held in the same room was Joseph McNutt. When McNutt asked him what the verdict was, Winner replied, "Oh, cremation in the first degree." It was agreed by the jury that Winner had set the fire. On June the 30th, 1874, Judge William P. Campbell sentenced both men to hang. They appealed to higher courts, but the verdicts were upheld. Judge Campbell ordered that they be imprisoned and serve hard labour for a year before an execution date be given by the state governor. Strangely, he even suggests at one point during his closing speech that they may never be executed, but says that they should not rely on that outcome and encourage them to be stand-up prisoners. For clarity, I'll quote Judge Campbell. He said, "It is the judgment and sentence of this court that you both be taken by the sheriff to the county jail, and then be securely bound with iron bands, that you are thence, without necessary delay, conveyed to the penitentiary of this state into the custody of the warden. After the expiration of 1 year of the date of your conviction, it shall be lawful for the governor of the state to issue a warrant commanding and directing the execution of either or both of you. Upon a scaffold erected within the walls of the penitentiary, he shall cause you to be hanged by your neck until you are dead. Now I give you a parting word of advice. Possibly the warrant may never be issued, and you may never be executed, but presume not too much on executive clemency. Cultivate and preserve as much as possible a tranquil state of mind. Be reconciled to your fate. Be obedient and submissive to your jailers and taskmasters." The two outlaws were imprisoned at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. They were put to work as shoemakers for Hancock, Roach and Company. It's said that they took to their roles with enthusiasm. The year passed, and no execution date was given. The words of Judge Campbell regarding their possible stay of execution proved to be prophetic. The Allen County Lola Register newspaper, dated July 17, 1875, wrote, "The notorious Wichita murderers Winner and McNutt have escaped execution because there is in force in Kansas a ridiculous law requiring the governor to become the executioner of the verdict of the juries in murder trials. When a criminal is found guilty of murder in the first degree and is sentenced to be hanged, he has a respite of 1 year, which is all right, but at the end of that time, if the governor fails to sign a warrant for his execution, the sentence is not enforced. The judicial branch of the government should execute its own sentences." Even though they had avoided the hangman's noose for now, the death sentence remained in place. In 1878 they made an appeal against it but were unsuccessful. On the day of their appeal, Wichita Eagle editor Marshall Murdoch wrote, "Much as we are opposed to the summary vengeance of mob law, those wretches might have been pulled limb from limb without protest." Despite their death sentences being upheld following the appeal, no such fate came. According to H. Craig Minor's 1982 book, Wichita: The Early Years, there was a growing aversion to the death sentence in Kansas at the time, and the author attributes this to why they were spared. McNutt and Winner proved to be productive model inmates too, which may have also served them well. After 18 years, they were eventually released, never to be heard from again. The blackened and scorched ruins of 73 Main Street lay untouched for 3 years, a grim reminder of what unfolded that fateful Christmas morning when a young man travelled from Missouri with high hopes for a better future, only to be brutally burned alive. After his major role in the McNutt and Winner affair, Sheriff William Smith found his way into the history books again in 1875, after an altercation with the famed lawman Wyatt Earp. Smith had accused young Wyatt of misusing his office to hire his brothers as lawmen. The two punched it out, with Earp coming out on top. He was fined $30. Most sources named Joseph's wife as Annie Belle. The St. Paul Pioneer Press, based in Minnesota, called her Rebecca in a 1951 retrospective report called The Case of the Convivial Partners. But seeing as all of the 1870s articles refer to her as Annie, so did I. Annie Belle McNutt, maiden name Bryant, originally from Liberty in Clay County, Missouri, was only 19 years old in 1873. It's said that she came from a poor but respectable family. At the age of 18, she moved to Leavenworth, Kansas, and worked in a hotel. This is where she met Joseph McNutt. Miss Bryant followed her Canadian lover to Missouri, moving in with him in August of 1873. They were married 3 months later. A month after that, Annie was to be embroiled in the Winner McNutt affair. I could not find any information on her following her acquittal. At the 5 minutes 46 seconds point of this video, I mentioned that Sheriff William Smith is told by the landlord of the Southern Hotel, John Ferris, that a horse had been stolen from the hotel's stable. The sheriff then speaks to a gang of teamsters who claims to have seen a horse being ridden by none other than Joseph McNutt on the night of the Main Street fire. I must state that this part of the story was only mentioned in the 1951 retrospective report by the St. Paul Pioneer Press. Nowhere else does it say that Joseph McNutt may have stolen a horse. The fire, we are told, was discovered at 3:30 a.m. Joseph McNutt said that he left the building in time to catch the 1:40 train out of Wichita, so he would have had to have left the building some time before the fire was set, unless the fire was extremely slow spreading, which is unlikely as the building would almost certainly have been built of wood. It's more likely that Arthur Winner bided his time in setting up the scene before lighting the fire, giving McNutt ample time to escape. This 1882 map shows the rail line east of Main Street. The station or depot where McNutt caught his train is seen in the top right of this 1877 image. The rail line, which remains in the same location today, was then known as the AT&SF, or Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad. It remained in operation until 1996, when it was taken over by BSNF, or Burlington Northern Santa Fe. 73 Main Street once stood close to the corner of Main Street and Waterman Street. It's also worth mentioning that Wichita's Main Street of the 1870s did not have the north and south name split as it does today.